Great. Thank you for joining us on Canada-China relations under Carney's government lessons from Australia. My name is Lynette Ong. I'm a professor of Chinese politics at the University of Toronto and director of China Governance Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Um, so just to give you a bit of introduction, what this webinar is about. So over the last decade, especially since the arrest of the two Michaels, Canada-China relations have sunk to new lows, and economic threats posed by Trump 2.0 um, have actually prompted the Canadian policy circle to reconsider our relations with China. And Australia, traditionally a U.S. ally, but has also forged, close economic relations with China, and has similarly seen kind of ups and downs of its relations with China. So today we are really fortunate to have with us two experts from Canada and from Australia, respectively, who specialize in Canada, Canada-China relations as well as Australia-China relations to talk about these very thorny policy issues, right? And I think both countries are middle power, both Canada and Australia are middle powers, and there are interesting lessons that maybe Canada can perhaps learn from Australia. So first off, we have Philippe Rheault, who assumed the leadership of the China Institute in 2023 following a 25-year career in the Canadian Diplomatic Service focused on China and East Asia. And over 6 postings, he served in Beijing, Taipei, Chongqing twice, Mongolia, and Guangzhou. He led 2 of Canada's 4 diplomatic missions in mainland China, and Philippe holds degree in philosophy, political science, and law, and is a member of the Quebec Bar, has served as an adjunct professor of political science at the University of Alberta, frequently cited in Canadian and international media. He has authored and co-authored several articles on China and is professionally fluent in Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, English, and French. We are also very fortunate to have Dr. James Lawrenson joining us from Sydney. So good morning to folks joining us from Sydney and Australia. James is an economist and director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. His academic interests research has been published in leading scholarly journals, including China Economic Review, China Economic Journal, Journal of Contemporary China, Australian Journal of International Affairs. Professor Lawrenson also provides regular commentary on contemporary developments on China's economy and Australia-China economic and broader relations, and has, cited and appeared in various top leading newspapers in Australia and the region. So really fortunate and grateful that the two experts could join us. So perhaps Philippe could kick off the conversation by sharing with us your insights about, the trajectory you think of Canada China relations.
Okay. Well, first of all, Lynette, a big thank you to you and to the Munk School for setting up this conversation. I'm also really grateful to have the chance to meet James virtually and also to learn from your thoughts, right? So I think this is a very fascinating topic and look forward to trying to take a deeper dive on it. I'll offer my remarks in a spirit of humility and look forward to some comments and also to the conversation afterwards. I think as you mentioned, Lynette, it's one might want to debate how successful Trump's international trade and trade policy and geopolitical policies are from a U.S. interest point of view. But one thing that's harder to debate is that he's certainly serving as a change accelerant when it comes to the trajectory of international relations. Countries around the world are trying to reevaluate their relationship with the United States and also their broader international posture. That's true of countries like India. We're seeing that in real time this week. It's true of countries like Japan and Korea, and it's certainly true as well of countries like Australia and Canada. And in the case of those two countries, I think in many instances, a lot of us have the reflex of thinking that both countries are quite similar, and therefore it's interesting to observe the experiences of each other vis-a-vis China, and also assume that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn together. I think that's certainly the case. But I also think it's important to note that there are some material differences as well in the way that Australia and Canada are able to navigate their relationships with China. So, if you will, I'll touch just very briefly on a couple areas where I think it's obvious that we do have commonalities. First of all, on the surface, we're both countries that are middle powers and that are trying in our own ways to balance U.S.-China within from that perspective. We're also two countries that are very, very dependent on international trade for our prosperity. Canada and Australia are also like-minded, liberal democracies, struggling to reconcile, in some cases, commercial engagement and political engagement. The kind of, to oversimplify perhaps, the values versus trade dilemma, I think, is one that always rises to the fore in different ways in both countries. We're also both very open, multicultural societies with significant and diverse Chinese diaspora communities, which gives us a lot of strength, but also poses specific challenges. And perhaps most germane to the topic today, we're both Canada and Australia have had their recent stay in the Chinese doghouse, if you will, and both have either already or are seeking to recalibrate relations with China. And in fact, both are also doing that with fresh faces. I think when Australia finally managed to, if James agrees, exit the doghouse, it was under a new leader. And so I'm not sure, I'll be interested to hear from James perhaps what concrete actions or even indeed concessions China made towards Australia made towards China. But actually, from afar anyway, it seemed like the major factor was a new face, an opportunity for a reset, and that actually Australia did not actually take that many measures to placate or satisfy China with respect to how they achieved that reset. But I'll leave that to James to perhaps comment on a little bit later. So there's a lot of things that we have in common, but there's also some differences that I think are important, Lynette, to highlight before we get to the politics. I think one of the biggest differences that is really hard to overstate is the different nature and quantum of our trade with both countries. So in the case of Canada, for example, uh, we are extremely reliant on the United States, both for our trade, international trade, and also for our security posture. Whereas in the case of Australia, Australia's largest trading partner is not the United States, it's China, by a significant margin. But a lot of its security arrangements are actually leaning towards the West and in tandem with Washington, right? So there's already there's a different kind of dynamic in play. And I think it's worth using a couple numbers very quickly to illustrate that, right? In the case of Canada, rough numbers, and we'll use US dollars to keep it simple because we have these two currencies. Canada in 24 roughly exported 500 billion US dollars to the United States. And it exported 25 billion US dollars to China, right? So it's a 20x factor between the US and China, and that first number is massive, right? In terms of the proportion, the impact it has on Canadian prosperity writ large, et cetera. It's a number that has to be taken into consideration when we're trying to triangulate US-China-Canada relations, right? Whereas in the case of Australia, Australia exported 200 billion US roughly to China in 24 and 100 billion to the United States. And so you can see there a much different kind of economic posture, right? So arguably, Australia is already decoupled in terms of security and trade, whereas Canada is not. And that's gonna mean some specific challenges, especially in the context of a truculent, impetuous, or unpredictable U.S. administration, right? So that means as well that Canada has to triangulate in real time now with respect to Washington, Beijing, and Ottawa. And I think it might explain some of the conundrum with respect to the EV/canola issues that we're facing right now. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later if that's of interest to you, Lynette. Um, I think also public opinion's and also another area that's worth taking a quick look at. Public opinion with respect to China and Canada is actually quite consensual and quite hawkish. There's been a little bit of a softening as a response to recent U.S. actions that are giving Canada a bit of a hard time. But generally speaking, it's quite homogeneous and it's quite hawkish vis-a-vis China. I think that's a reflection in part of the Meng Wanzhou to Michael's episode and the fact that there's still a lot of scar tissue that is left to heal there. And I'll look to James for more on this, but my sense is that public opinion in Australia is a little bit more varied. There's more voices around the table. And that might actually be a reflection of the fact that there's a lot more trade happening between Australia and China than there is between Canada and China, which means there are more stakeholders involved. And so a more kind of like diversity in terms of the opinions, right? Now, notwithstanding that, it's interesting to note that Australia has also, in my opinion, moved more forcefully and effectively to counter some of the more malignant actions that China may be attempting towards either of our countries. And these are mechanisms that Canada is actually only now really starting to emulate, right? So those are some reasons why there's not a perfect equivalency between Australia and Canada. There's also a couple cards that Australia has to play that Canada doesn't, I think. We've talked about the economic side, perhaps a little bit more agency there, ability to kind of like chart its own path. But it's also important to note how integrated the Canadian supply chains are into the US economy. And so, notwithstanding the numbers, it's also in terms of ability to move away from that. Just as an example, 75% of Canada's manufactured intermediate goods are actually exported to the United States, right? So in terms of supply chains, the leverage that the US has on Canada in terms of constraining some other potential trade paths is actually significant. Geopolitically as well, Australia is a bona fide regional player in the South Pacific, whereas Canada doesn't have that kind of same explicit security posture. Now, before I pass it on, Lynette, and we can kind of talk about any topic you want after that, I think it's also useful perhaps for James and the audience to hear that it's not all bad news for Canada when it comes to trying to chart a new path forward that suits Canadian interests. Canada also arguably has a few good but different cards to play that I'd like the audience to take into account. The first one is that Canada, I think it's fair to say, has a more textured and diversified economy than Australia does. We do have a strong resource base, but we're also probably have more to offer in terms of advanced manufacturing, have a pharmaceutical industry, aerospace industry, developed automotive industry. We're strong in software, gaming, artificial intelligence in ways that perhaps Australia is kind of lagging behind a little bit. It might also seem like an albatross right now, but the fact that we're so deeply integrated into the largest economic bloc in the world with US and Mexico over the medium term does pay dividends and makes Canada an attractive target for FDI on the part of third countries, including China. So that's something that, is a card that could be played, although it needs to be played judiciously, of course. And also much larger and deeper capital markets. Canadian stock markets have more than twice the market cap of and the amount of capital that Australian ones do. And they're also focused on areas of Chinese interest, such as resources and mining and energy and what have you, right? So another card that could or could not be played, that's debatable, but that it exists, right? And maybe a couple more quick points. This is a recent phenomenon, but it's definitely noteworthy. There's a fast-growing energy export relationship between Canada and China. Since we've been able to bring oil to Tidewater on the Pacific, nary a year and a half ago, China has emerged as the most significant purchaser in Asia, and that trend is set to continue. We're talking about 500,000 barrels a day going forward, and that's projected to grow. That's a lot of oil. It puts Canada as the second largest supplier of oil to China after Russia. So, to put that into perspective, and may possibly, one would hope, give us a little bit more diplomatic relevance and traction when it comes to trying to resolve any future disputes, right? And finally, perhaps I'll just note that, beyond canola and a couple of other areas such as seafood, I think it's fair to say that also Canada's export mix towards China is actually less easy to substitute than Australia's, where the big export is iron ore, which is hyper fungible. But I'm maybe venturing on uncertain terrain there. But that kind of insulates the trade relationship from the politics, and we saw that during the Three Michaels era, where notwithstanding very, very difficult bilateral political relations, Canada-China trade was at record levels, right? So you can see that there's a complementarity there that seems to be somewhat insulated from the politics, right? So, to sum it up, I would say that Australia seems to have more geoeconomic leverage in Asia and is probably have more robust safeguards at this point on interference and things of that nature. But Canada still has a quite interesting kind of diversified hand of cards to play, and arguably a bit of a stronger kind of coalition building and soft power reputation that may or may not be deserved, but still exists that allows us to kind of rally the troops internationally as well when it comes to dealing with China going forward. That's something that also makes us a desirable interlocutor for China when it tries to, as we've noticed again in the last couple of days, reset the narrative when it comes to global governance with now the fourth initiative, right, which is after the first three global initiatives, we're now with the global governance initiative that was launched last week. So just a few thoughts to try to help situate the comparison, Lynette. But in the interest of time, I might stop here and happy to jump in later again.
Sure. So
Mm.
what I'm hearing is that we are comparing oranges with apples, so not strictly comparable. Um, so James, perhaps we can move on to you and give us your take about, what Canada can possibly learn from Australia's relations with China. And I will allow some time for the two of you to have some back and forth
Mm.
on your comments.
Thanks very much for the invitation, Lynette. I really appreciate it, and great to be having this discussion with you, Philippe. Yeah, my opening remarks will overlap some areas that Philippe touched on. I think it is useful to highlight the commonalities, but also the differences. And I agree, there are some pretty strong differences that we do need to take into account. One commonality, of course, is around the size of our Chinese diaspora communities. I know Canada's Chinese diaspora community is huge. It's about 5% of your population, which is double that of the United States. You may be aware that in Australia, it's actually even higher. It's closer to 6%. So that's one commonality. I also think there's a commonality between Australia and Canada in terms of how we think about China both as a security risk, just in a general sense, a security risk, but also presenting economic opportunities. But I think that's also where the divergence opens up. I just think for Australia, that sense of China as a security risk and an economic opportunity is just many times more acute. Of course, there's security risks from China that we share in equal measure, for example, around Chinese government interference in domestic politics. But, being located in the Western Hemisphere, sharing a border with the world's largest superpower, does mean, I think, that Canada's sense of China as a military threat, for example, is far more subdued than it is for Australia in the Eastern Hemisphere, on the bottom edge of Southeast Asia, and a long way from our traditional security allies. And again, on the economic piece, there's commonalities. Both of our countries are significant raw materials, agricultural exporters, including to China. But again, for Australia, the scale is wildly different. As Philippe said, about 70% of Canada's exports go to the United States. Only about 5% of Australia's does. So for us, the US market is a really marginal concern for our economy. In contrast, China accounts for about 1/3 of our exports. China is actually larger than our next four largest markets combined. And it's not just about iron ore. China is also our largest market for fuels. It's our largest market for agricultural goods. It's our largest market for tourism. It's our largest market for education. So it is really across the board. Another thing I think it is important to note on the economic side of things is that I understand that Canada has a trade deficit with China. That's not the case here. China is actually the source of Australia's largest bilateral trade surplus. So it means we have as an economist, bilateral trade surpluses and deficits don't worry me. But in terms of how that plays out in the domestic politics, it does mean, for example, there is no discussion in Australia about China taking away domestic jobs because we have this massive trade surplus with China. That sense of China being a security risk and an economic opportunity, and the fact that both sides are so visceral in Australia, it means that neither side of Australian politics can go all in on one or the other. That leads to this extraordinary bipartisan political consensus in Australia on China policy. Let me give you for example, when it comes to the AUKUS partnership, for example, well, that's all about providing military deterrence against China, and both sides of Australian politics are firm supporters of that. On the other hand, you've also got both sides of Australian politics saying they want to trade more with China, not less. Let me give an example of how this can play out in public. In September 2019, our then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was standing next to Donald Trump in the Oval Office. Trump invited Morrison to, quote, express his very strong opinions on China. Here's Morrison's response, quote, "We work well with China. We have a great relationship with China. China's growth has been great for Australia," close quote. Similarly, earlier this year, when we were getting some pressure from the White House that they would prefer that we curtail our trade relationship with China, here's what our trade minister said in response, quote, "Chinese trade is almost 10 times more valuable to Australia. We don't want to do less business with China. We want to do more business with China. We'll make decisions about how we continue to engage with China based on our national interests and not on what the Americans may or may not want," close quote. Now, that is extremely strong language for a country that is a very staunch US security ally, but it makes the point those economic equities are so visceral that neither side of politics can walk away from them. You may think that the experience of Australia having been targeted with economic coercion from China, and Beijing gave us a good whack, I hope we can talk more about that in the next half an hour or so, would have tipped the balance away from Australia seeing China as an economic opportunity. But in fact, what it did was gave Australia more confidence that it was a risk that we could manage. And what we also learnt was that no one else is going to come and save us, including our geopolitical mates, our best geopolitical mate, the United States. In fact, the country's companies that snapped up most lost Australian sales in China were in fact American companies. So that's quite a reality check. Now, look, I'll finish with this point. It's getting onto the public opinion point that Philippe made, and I think this is an important one. The Australian public haven't been presented with a lot of diversity on policy. Both sides are more or less in lockstep. But what they have been given a clear choice on is the practice of diplomacy. Back in the previous days of the coalition conservative governments in Australia, they made a calculation that Australia not only needed to harden its policy settings to deal with genuine security risks, but also that there would be domestic political advantage in ramping up the China threat narrative. You had extraordinary scenes where the defense minister was comparing China to Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and the prime minister was calling the shadow defense minister a Manchurian candidate in the domestic parliament. What the then opposition progressive left, centre-left Labor government volunteered was that they would continue with policy continuity on China, but they promised that they would reset the diplomatic tone. We found out the result at the 2022 election. The coalition's attempt to ramp up the China threat actually backfired in a big way at the federal election in 22. That was particularly evident in localities with high proportions of Chinese Australians, but it wasn't just located there. Afterwards, the coalition government said that they learnt their domestic political lesson and that they needed to rebuild their relationship with Chinese Australians. And so for the rest of that term from 2022 to 2025, the opposition moderated its tone on China. Yet in the lead up to the election we had earlier this year, as it became clear in public polling that the coalition was slipping behind again, you saw them ramping up the China threat narrative once again. And yet again, they got punished at the ballot box. So what we have a situation now is we've got a Labor government led by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who went off to China in July on an extraordinarily long 6-day trip. And you could see that he was doing that with confidence. We have a fairly rabid right-wing press in Australia. They were highly critical of Albanese's decisions to go to China, particularly before he went to the United States to meet Donald Trump. But it was clear to me that Prime Minister Albanese was simply confident in the domestic politics and he didn't really care. And he's got good reason to be confident. If you look at opinion polling, it shows that Australians see the Albanese Labor government as more competent in managing foreign policy generally and the China relationship specifically. Just 1 in 5 Australians see China principally as a threat to be confronted. Rather, a clear 2/3 majority regard it as a complex relationship to be managed. So, the domestic politics in Australia around China are interesting. No Australian government can afford to appear weak on China as a security threat, but nor can any Australian government afford to ignore the economic opportunities. And the Australian public overwhelmingly takes the view that calm and professional diplomacy is the way to manage that challenge. I'll stop there.
Maybe a couple quick responses, Lynette.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
So the first thing is that's very noteworthy, the public opinion that you're mentioning, James, in Australia vis-a-vis the China question. It's also useful to note that in Canada, prior to not only the Hmong episode, but also I think what in Canada was perceived as a slightly over-the-top kind of wolf warrioristic pronouncements and attitudes on the part of China, the Canadian attitudes towards China was actually a lot more positive as well, right? But perhaps not to that level, but it's really at a bit of a nadir right now. So that certainly helps governments enact policy making. Another difference, perhaps, that is also noteworthy is that majority governments help when it comes to making policy on difficult topics. And Australia has the luxury of one right now, whereas Canada has not over the last few years. And I think that might also have hamstrung a little bit. I think what really something that really struck me that I found interesting, James, is earlier in your remarks you were noting how perhaps Australia is even more at the sharp end of the spear when it comes to being exposed to security threats from China, given its proximity and not being in the backyard of the U.S., et cetera, et cetera. But what struck me, it continues to strike me, is that while that might be the case, Australians seem to be willing to take a more pragmatic approach towards China than Canadians, right? And so so assuming that your statement is correct, Australia is more exposed to security threats from China than Canada is, although we won't belittle the threat ecosystem in Canada either. And yet it's in Canada that we have where we have maybe the luxury is perhaps the wrong word, but the ability to ponder at length the connection between, for example, values, security threats, and commercial engagement in a way that seems to not exist in Australia, where we kind of say, well, there may be threats there, but the economic opportunities are something different, and we can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. Whereas Canada has actually always, in many cases, tried to kind of like deconstruct that dichotomy in a way that is very difficult, right? Perhaps a trade surplus helps when you're looking at things, as opposed to, as you noted, a very large trade deficit. And certainly we're seeing echoes of we're seeing the beginning of a change here in Canada as well, as a function of the Trump actions, Trump 2.0, as Lynette would say. In fact, since you were quoting some leaders, this is hot off the press, I think, from this morning. Prime Minister Carney, on the way into a cabinet meeting in Toronto, a cabinet planning meeting, to paraphrase, said, on the China file, and this is new language for him, right? This is noteworthy. So we have differences with China and different approaches on a variety of things, but they are our second largest trading partner, and there are areas where we can cooperate, and we will look to potentially expand those areas of cooperation in ways that are consistent with Canadian interests. Respect Canadian sovereignty and security while expanding the relationship with China in areas that it does well. So that's noteworthy. I think that's hot off the press, and I think that that's the Prime Minister trying to signal to Canadians that that there may be a rapprochement in the works. I think it's also perhaps the Prime Minister trying to lay the markers, because I think this is pure speculation, but the Canadian public will start running out of patience if he's unable to come to an agreement with the United States in the coming months. And to the extent that the tea leaves are not looking good, they need to start pivoting to third countries, and China's going to be one of those, right? So I think it's all because of the overwhelming predominance of the Canada-US trading relationship. Unfortunately, I apologize for always bringing back the US into the calculation when it comes to Canada, but I think it's normal for any Canadian government to be very cautious in taking risk vis-a-vis compromising our commercial relationship with the United States in order to deepen a much smaller relationship with China. But if the sense is becoming that all we're going to get from Washington are demands but no concessions, they will have to pivot at some point. And to me, this quote from the Prime Minister this morning, I don't know what Lynette might think, but to me that sounds like Prime Minister's laying the markers and trying to lay some groundwork for an incremental kind of recalibration of China policy, at the very least on the trade side of things, right? So if I might add one more comment, maybe that to try to launch another thread of debate that we may or may not have time to talk about, but I think is worth thinking about, is, to my mind, as the Canadian government starts doing that, I think we should be looking at the Chinese market as a means to develop optionality vis-a-vis the United States, and resilience and leverage vis-a-vis China. So not necessarily pursue all opportunities at once, but prioritize the ones that give optionality to Canada vis-a-vis Washington, such as energy, for example. I mentioned the rising exports of Canadian oil to China. Well, that has had many knock-on effects, but one that's quite interesting is that it actually has raised the price that the United States pays for the same oil, even if the oil that it's buying is being shipped by land. So you can see how there you're creating optionality, resilience, and opportunity for Canada by trying to not play both off on each other, but focus on areas that give us more leverage with both.
Very good. If I could just sum up what Philippe and James have touched upon, I think what you guys have highlighted is that these are two pairs of not symmetrical relationship. All right, there are some similarities, but also differences, particularly in terms of Australia's trade reliance on China compared to Canada's security, as well as very close security and trade partnership with China. So they are not strictly comparable. Canada, because of our geographical position and history, are much closer to the United States and further away from China, as perhaps as a not out of a choice, but for historical reason as well as geographical reason as well. So they are not strictly comparable, even though we are both middle power and we share similar democratic values. And both of us and both countries have host, sizable number of Chinese diaspora, 6% in Australia and 5% in Canada. And also changing, I think, demographic profile of Chinese diaspora, right? Particularly, I think after COVID and after Hong Kong protests, we have younger people coming in that embraces new democratic values, and some of them trying to lobby respective government for changes with respect to policies towards China. I think that's kind of similar in that areas, and I think both Chinese diasporas in both countries have been the target of transnational repression from the United Front and the PRC. So perhaps there are some notes to be exchanged on that front. Another thing that I have picked up on is public opinions towards China in both countries, right? I think across Western democracies, we have seen kind of public opinion towards China has dipped after COVID. Very, you look at Pew public opinion polls of the population throughout Western democracies, the favorability towards China have dipped, but in the last couple of months, it have also picked up again relative to the United States, simply because of Trump. So, the narrative of the China threat has changed, as James has described, and that has implications for, kind of various governments in the ballot box. So, having just spent summer in Southeast Asia, particularly Singapore, this is actually very much highlighted in changing dynamics of the perception of China and the implications on what the government is prepared to do. So, for those of you, who have been might or might not be aware of, a country like Singapore and mainland Southeast Asia have been sitting on the fence, playing hedging with both countries, like refusing to take sides for a long time. But under Trump 2.0, and I think things are changing, countries feel that they are still have a very contentious relations with China, but they feel that even on the security front, they cannot be as close with the United States as they have before. And I think in Canada, Philippe can tell me what you think, but I think things are also changing how we think about security partnership with the United States in the last couple of months since the re-election of Trump 2.0. I think public opinion is something that is of importance, because in democracies, ultimately I think politicians have to think about what the public opinion think of their policies and action, and treat it as an imperative when election comes. So this is perhaps something that we want to talk about more in the Q&A. The final thing that I've picked up on from what James and Philippe said earlier is that, especially for Australia, it has seen kind of Chinese trade coercion threat as something that is actually manageable, which is, I think, interesting because we have got a lot of international economy emerging literature on weaponized interdependence, and they have used kind of China as an example, and now America under Trump as an example. But you are saying that that sort of trade coercion is actually manageable. And I recently did a paper also on looking at the first episode of trade coercion on Canada by China, looking at various sector. There was some impact on canola producers, but overall the impact has been manageable, has been pretty minimal, because China can impose trade coercion, but there's also changing external circumstances that they cannot control. And you can always divert your trade in various ways through third-party markets that I think that are also outside China's control. So I'll leave it here and open up for questions, and I'll leave it to Philippe and James whether you want to address some of my comments before we open up.
I might just quickly say a couple things on the economic coercion front, because that came up in several comments from Philippe and yourself as well, Lynette.
Sure.
Economic coercion, I think it's always important to keep in mind, it's actually a pretty tough game for the aggressor to play, just as the United States is learning now with respect to China and other countries. That's because economic exchange is by definition win-win. So when you cut it off, it's by definition lose-lose. So what Australia found out was that there are a whole bunch of big ticket items in the trade relationship that Beijing was not prepared to touch. Iron ore, lithium, wheat, wool, LNG, many more. Then there was a bunch of goods that Beijing was prepared to hit because it could find alternative sources of supply. But then what Australia also found out was overwhelmingly in those areas, we were not defenseless. If China didn't want our coal producers largely just shrugged their shoulders. Same with our beef producers, same with our barley producers. These are goods that are traded in open and competitive global markets, which means there's just a natural defensive mechanism for countries that are targeted with coercion that they can resort to. And I think that also feeds into public opinion too. Because I should make it very, very clear. I don't want to give your audience the impression that public opinion in Australia towards China is all sunlight and roses, right? It is certainly not. If you ask Australians, do they have, we have an annual poll of the public opinion at the Australia-China Relations Institute. And if you ask Australians, do they have concerns about the China relationship, about two-thirds of Australians will say yes. But then if you ask them, should we forge closer ties with China, about two-thirds of Australians will say yes. I don't think that means they're confused. I think that means they're very pragmatic. And they understand that there's genuine risks, but there's also economic equities that we can't and shouldn't walk away from.
Very interesting. So, China Governance Lab did a joint study with an NPO in Canada about a year ago. We poll kind of favorability rating of China across the board. So this is before Trump came into power, and according to demographic, surprisingly and consistently, young people in Canada hold more favorable views towards China than older folks or people in the middle age. So that perhaps tells you something.
Yeah, that's the same in Australia too, Leonard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's take some question. So a question for James and both speakers. Did China's economic coercion have any electoral impact for Australia in 2022 beyond the districts with large Chinese communities? In other words, did producers whose livelihoods were affected by the sanctions turn their back against the coalition? You are
Sorry,
muted.
there was very little criticism of the Australian government for not backing down to Chinese pressure. Even amongst the business communities, there was no high-level business advocacy pushing the Australian government to make concessions to China. I think what we mostly saw was that in those affected, as I said before, most of the affected businesses could actually readily defend themselves. So that also reduced their incentive to lobby the Australian government. What we saw a political backlash from was the then Morrison's government effort to ramp up the China threat. I think that actually is what produced a political backlash against the government, because most Australians didn't want the Australian government to make policy concessions to China, but recognizing that those economic relationships are important, they also didn't want to see the government unnecessarily hype up the threat. And I think the political sense amongst the Australian public was that's what the Australian government was doing, and that's what led to a backlash, not the government's policy settings.
Right. So that was a question from Yin Liu. Next question from William Chung. How big a trade surplus does Australia have with China? And has this surplus given China any upper hand in dealing with Australia?
The surplus is worth about $100 billion. So we export around 200 billion to China. We import around 100 billion. So it's a massive trade surplus. And in fact, our largest bilateral trade deficit is with respect to the United States. So it's a very different discussion. Has that given China any leverage? No, it hasn't, because the goods that China buys from Australia, as I said before, are goods that it needs. For example, around 60% of China's iron ore that it needs comes from Australia. So it just can't walk away from that relationship. And there's a whole bunch of other goods, wheat, wool, LNG, lithium, where China also has quite a large dependence on Australia. Does tend to be a view that Australia is economically dependent on China. I overwhelmingly reject that. I think the two countries are mutually interdependent with each other.
James, a quick follow-up. I'm just curious, and by the way, I completely agree. I think this is a narrative that needs to be reset in Canada as well. There's lots of opportunity coming from China, but for the same reasons you spelled out earlier, there's not that much leverage that China has on Canada in the current kind of trade dynamics, where we import $100 billion of goods from China every year, and where we export 30 billion. 25 billion of which are commodities, many of which ex-canola, if you're hitting canola 3 weeks before the harvest, but ex that type of situation, most of them are quite fungible, right? So, but I was curious, James, about wine. So I was in China during some of the ups and downs, most of them that occurred. Now I'm I'm aware that, from a big picture perspective, the numbers are insignificant, but I'm wondering, is that a vocal constituency? Did those stakeholders make a lot of noise? Because clearly that must have had an impact on the wine producers. I'm just wondering if you could just share a little bit on that, right?
Yeah, you're quite right. So I don't mean to give the impression that there weren't individual sectors that did suffer. Really, there were only two. One is wine and the other is lobsters. I think the first point to note there is that, yes, there were some complaints from that sector, but we're talking about one sector in the Australian economy. So the idea that the political lobbying power of that one sector would have the ability to shift Canberra's foreign policy positions, I mean, that's an incredible stretch that we'd never see. The other thing to note, I think, about the wine producers, um, they didn't have that exposure to China because they were naive or stupid. They literally had no other options. For example, what we saw during the period where China imposed extremely large prohibitive tariffs in excess of 100% on Australian wine exporters, our second and third largest markets, the UK and the US, those markets actually shrunk. So there are some industries where the ability to mitigate risk is just not there. Lobster is another one. Again, they were selling more than 90% of their output to China. So the cheap criticism is that they're naive and not alive to geopolitical risk. But the bottom line is China accounts for more than 90% of global live rock lobster imports. So where else are you going to go? So since those economic coercion campaign has Beijing's backed off, you've seen Australian wine and Australian lobster rush back to China. That's not because they're naive to geopolitical risk. It's just that's the economic costs and benefits those two industries face.
Okay. Next question from Ashley Fan. Does Carney's remark about China amount to hedging? How effective do you think it is likely to be given Canada's dependence on the United States? I think this question is for Philippe.
Yeah, well, we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier. I haven't had a chance to have like deep insight into the thinking of the Carney government's foreign policy team just yet. But from what I have seen and heard, I think the new prime minister's instincts are quite pragmatic. But he also needs to conjugate that with the existing kind of ecosystem of public opinion. And I also think that he's going to try to do that in a way that minimizes Canadian vulnerabilities and doubles down on opportunity. Now, that being said, because he is also stuck in the conundrum of needing to be very mindful of U.S. reactions on anything that Canada does vis-a-vis China, he's going to be quite constrained in the way he moves forward. I think Lynette, the current decision on the part of the recent decision on the part of China to put 75% tariffs on Canadian canola exports is indicative of China basically reminding the prime minister that he does not have the luxury of dealing with the United States and China in sequence, right? That he's going to have to deal with them both at the same time, right? So I know this might sound a bit surprising, but I don't think that China is looking for a fight with Canada right now. But I think they are putting the government on notice that while it might be more convenient for the prime minister to say, okay, I just got elected, number one priority is to normalize our relationship with the United States. Let's have a quick call with Premier Li Qiang. Tell him, look, we're going to reset this. Don't worry, and then say, okay, we'll call you back next year while we deal with Trump. Right? I think that would have been the ideal sequence for the Ottawa side. But Beijing is now giving a shot across the bow, saying, "Look, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to triangulate between Ottawa and Beijing, between Washington and Beijing in real time." And I think that contrary to perhaps the wine lobby in Australia, the canola lobby is actually they're bigger numbers, first of all, and they're geographically concentrated in a very crucial part of the country. And so that's an added bonus for the Chinese, I think, which is that this canola issue is actually now starting to pit the interests of central Canadian manufacturers against the interests of Western Canadian agricultural exporters, which adds another sense of urgency to it and is going to force the government to triangulate more quickly than it would have liked to.
Sure. That is my reading too. I think China is trying to patch up trade relations with Canada, but it's also trying to do it in a way that it has a bit more leverage over Canada. It's a complex situation. So to answer the question of whether can I find recording of this video after the webinar, we will be sending the recording around to people who have registered. There's a question from Sun Wanning. How is the narrative and rhetoric of China threat impacting on the sense of identity and belonging among Chinese Canadian communities? And is there any data? Philippe, you have something to say about that? I can pitch in.
Please do. I mean, I don't have any data that comes to mind. I think this is going to be a challenge as we re-engage with a challenging China. I think it's going to be a challenge because I think the same for Australia. Australia and Canada, we boast open multicultural societies.
Yeah.
And that underpins our country's strength and attractiveness, right?
Yes.
But how that's going to play on the Chinese community is also complex because it's not monolithic, right? And so
Yeah.
I wonder if it's
Yeah.
possible to get data on that, actually.
So in the public opinion poll that I mentioned earlier that we did with Digital Public Square about 9 months ago now, it shows that the Chinese diasporas are quite concerned about the impact of foreign influence and transnational repression on the Chinese diaspora community. Our sample size is not terribly large because we have a national sample of 2,000 and we oversample Chinese diasporas. But people are very aware of this issue, and identity issue is becoming very salient, especially after COVID. And I think this is not unique to Canada, but also felt across Australia, I think, for a longer time period. And Canada is only just picking up on this sentiment. So this is a discussion that we could have more in the near future for sure.
Yeah, maybe I
There's
might just add, Lynette, that many Canadians are concerned about a whole wide range of Chinese actions vis-a-vis Canada. I think
Right.
some are more worthy of concern than others, and we should be doubling down our attention and our resources on conduct that is egregious and worthy of true concern. And certainly, from that perspective, transnational repression would be on that list.
Yes, and we have conducted, the government has conducted 2 rounds of inquiry into foreign influence, but has been short of, saying anything on transnational repression. So this is something that I think the diaspora communities will be looking to the Carney government for some response in the next couple of years. A question from an anonymous attendee: how does Australia export its higher education to China, such as the high QS ranking of Australian universities? I think that's also changing, right?
Yeah, but I can tell you that Chinese student numbers at Australian universities right now are at record highs. And in fact, Australian universities could enrol more Chinese students. They would like to, but our government has signaled that it's going to put in place a cap on international students. But that remains robust. I think the big risk for Australian universities when it comes to China engagement now is not so much around student numbers. It's actually in the research collaboration piece. There's a whole bunch of research areas where China, over the last 5-10 years, has become Australia's #1 research collaboration partner. But over the last few years, policy settings have shifted such that universities have to prioritize risk in a much stronger way. And so you're seeing some of the eroding of those networks. That's a bit of a problem because it's not clear to me that if we lose China as a collaboration partner, that other opportunities will open up. I don't think we've got leading US universities knocking down the doors of Australian universities, desperately wanting to partner with us. So that's a risk we have to keep in mind.
Sure. So in the interest of time, I'll take questions from people who have not asked before. From Jack Eghurst: should Canada continue to limit or outright ban FDI from China in critical sectors like mining and Arctic infrastructure? So that's for you, Philippe.
Well, it's important, difficult question. My sense is that Canada should do a better job actually domestically of assessing and articulating which parts of the Canadian economy are open for FDI, and in particular open for FDI from China, and which parts are not. I think right now it's much fuzzier. And I think that, I think the silver lining there is that a lot of the homework that remains to be done is homework that's within our own control. It's about getting proponents of economic activity around the same table with proponents of security and risk mitigation, and coming up with the challenging but achievable consensuses where we can identify areas that actually where Canada needs capital and the risks is manageable, and other areas where actually we should just take everything off the table, right? So I think that there is an opportunity under this new government to take that type of more pragmatic, but also an approach that's just that brings together concerns about security, resilience, and also economic opportunity in a way that actually allows us to protect what needs to be protected at the same time, not leave much needed capital on the table when the risks are manageable.
Right. A question from Kevin Choi. How can Canada develop a balanced and pragmatic strategy that simultaneously addresses its national security concerns and Chinese influence threats, while fostering deeper economic ties with China, drawing on lessons from Australia's more active and pragmatic engagement approach? Well, I think if we can answer these questions, we can sit in the PMO. But does but does any of you want to have a shot?
Go ahead, James.
No, that one's
Okay,
for you,
look, I
Philippe.
think the seeds of the answer are in the question itself, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe we'll in the interest of time, we'll leave it at that. But I think we've also been unpacking some of the challenges that would lead us to that type of policy over the last hour or so. Right? Yeah.
Sure. Any last words from James?
I think if there was one lesson I think the Australian experience does offer, it's that countries are best to avoid being flamboyant in poking China in the eye. But at the same time, you should have confidence in your own system. Some quiet confidence, I think, is well and truly, deserved. That's certainly what we learned in Australia around the economic piece. And even on the diaspora piece, I'd emphasize that point as well. At the end of 2018, Australia introduced very tough new foreign interference laws. There's been 3 cases brought since those laws were introduced. All of them have related to Chinese interference. So that's a policy setting, but at the same time, you've got to be very careful that you don't allow that discussion to run off the rails. In fact, we had a former spy agency boss here saying it was very easy for that discussion to slip off the rails, and suddenly there are, quote, erroneous assertions flying around that there are spies under every bed. Our current spy boss says, quote, well, attempts to interfere in our democratic processes are common. Successful interference is not. Our democracy remains robust. Our parliaments remain sovereign. So I would encourage Canada as it has that conversation. It's a serious conversation that needs to be engaged in, but you can do it in a calm and confident way. And I think the Australian lesson offers the lessons of how to do it wrong, and more recently, how to do it right.
I mean, that's a very, very interesting. I mean, it's an important remark. I think this is a discussion, a public discourse that we should have in Canada. As I've read, I've seen the word spies and espionage being thrown around in a very liberal manner in our media, and I'm quite concerned about it. And I think we should be careful about, various things. So on that front, I think the Australian debate is worth looking at. Any last word from you, Philippe?
I'd like to respond to that, but given the interest, I think we're running out of time. So instead, what I will say, I do like the idea of being more confident. Being my sense is we'd also be a bit more proactive as opposed to reactive when it comes to these types of issues. But I did want to make sure I got in on something, Lynette, because you mentioned a couple times how during the conversation, perhaps it's my fault because I wasn't underlining the complementary enough. But I think that Australia and Canada are actually quite comparable in many ways, right? There are differences, but there are also commonalities. And perhaps more importantly, I think that we're very complementary. And I say that especially when it comes to a topic we did not discuss today, but I think is important, and that's on the global stage, right? I think what we see now right now is it's a US that's retrenching. It's creating space for other actors. You have an increasingly assertive China, but China is not able or arguably even willing to replace the US completely globally in every sphere. That creates a lot more space for agency for third countries. And I think that like-minded liberal democracies need to get together, maybe even sometimes uncomfortably, with other partners that are not necessarily like-minded, but that are aligned along issue A, B, or C. So, for example, safeguarding the WTO or some other key multilateral issue, right? So, I think if Canada and Australia can find ways to work together on leading those types of agendas, then the fact that we're not exactly the same actually gives us a complementarity that means we have more cards to play. So I think that that is something that is worth thinking about both for Canada and Australia, because really just relying on like-mindedness and the old rules-based international order is not going to get us as far as it used to.
Very well put. My conclusion from your remark is that the Aussies and the Canadians should meet more often in person and virtually to exchange notes. So thank you for joining us on this very rich and productive discussion. I really enjoyed remarks from both Philippe and James. And thank you, the audience, for joining us. Good evening and good morning to folks from Australia. Thank
Great
you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.